would say the biggest takeaway is that, it was a successful pilot. We demonstrated that the lower carbon mixes performed just as well. They met all our performance requirements. There wasn't any impact on schedule, or cost, or availability. There weren't any red flags essentially really raised.
Hey everybody, Chris Neidl here from the OpenAir Collective. Thanks for tuning into this installment of 20-something minutes. In this episode, I'm joined by my fellow OpenAir collector, Adina Banayan, and we speak with Stacey Foreman, who manages the City of Portland's Sustainable Procurement Program, which includes the really pioneering work that Portland is doing regarding low embodied carbon concrete. They really are a municipal leader within the United States, really taking concrete seriously as a factor in climate change and how to decarbonize it through smart policies. Now, in this role, Stacey conceived, planned, and led the execution of the city's low carbon concrete sidewalk pilot, where they had a specific focus on the implementation of low embodied carbon concrete for sidewalks. This project actually has been a kind of a major inspiration actually for our own Open Source Sidewalk initiative, which we're launching in 2021. So in this call, we have a great conversation with Stacey. She tells us a little bit about, first, some context about Portland's program, how this fed right into a focus on sidewalks, why sidewalks are relevant, and how the program was really conceived and designed and who it involved within the city, and ultimately how it was executed and what was learned. So we're really grateful for the conversation. It was really interesting and great insights, and I hope you enjoy it. So Stacey, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So as we've discussed, our program has been really inspired by what you're doing in Portland. Obviously, Portland has been a real leader nationally among municipalities, probably internationally, in terms of taking concrete seriously in regards to climate. Maybe as a way of starting before we really get into sidewalks, just give us a little quick overview of what's happening in Portland regarding low embodied carbon concrete.
Yeah, so the low carbon concrete initiative that I started really developed out of the Sustainable Procurement Program at the city, which I manage. And it's a combination of that program and the fact that the city does have a lot of track record and passion around addressing climate change and greenhouse gas emissions in general. And so what happened was in 2016, we did a sustainable supply chain analysis looking at the carbon emissions associated with our spend, like what the city spends money on, really looking into our supply chain. And what we found from that analysis was that not only that we confirmed that greenhouse gas emissions were a significant environmental impact area for our supply chain, but also that within that, construction services really is our primary category. And that's not only because we spend a lot of money on construction services at the city, but also because it's carbon intensive. And when I peeled back the layers some more about what to really prioritize within construction services in terms of what could we tackle, it really bubbled up these materials that we use. And we do use a lot of concrete. We do a lot of infrastructure work, more so than buildings. And so concrete naturally bubbled up to that as an area to focus on. And the nice thing about looking at concrete is also that there's already readily available opportunity to reduce the carbon footprint of concrete. So it was really about trying to understand, well, what are some of the barriers? Why aren't people taking advantage of things that are already existing in terms of alternatives to cement? And that's how the low carbon concrete initiative really got started, and began with first trying to get more data about the carbon footprint of the mixes we already use. And so in 2019, we began requiring that environmental product declarations forms be submitted to us whenever a producer wanted to have a concrete mix on our city pre-approved list. So that began our work of trying to understand where we already were with our current mixes. And then we began with trying to answer some of those questions about, well, what are the concerns that our project managers or engineers really have around using alternatives to 100% cement mixes? That's where the initiative has grown since then.
And it's currently implemented, right?
Right. So we have been requiring EPDs since the beginning of 2020.
Gotcha. So just to get into sidewalks right now, and we were Obviously, Portland last year looks like they conducted a low carbon concrete pilot with sidewalks, and you published a great report, which we'll link in the notes below. Can you tell us a little bit about why sidewalks at this early stage of the program? Why the focus on that application as opposed to something else?
There are a few reasons. When I started this initiative, I started looking around our different departments that do the infrastructure work and started asking questions about, well, what do they think would make the most sense to pilot? And after some of those discussions, it really became clear that doing some sort of study, a pilot on flat work, concrete applications made sense, partially because we do a lot of that kind of work, and also partially because it's a relatively low risk application, right? There's, if the concrete were to fail for some reason or crack or otherwise not perform in the same way that we would expect it to, the risk level is relatively low. So that said, we also went down the path of sidewalks because our transportation bureau was willing to participate and conduct the pilot. So I had some very willing stakeholders to work with. So combination of both.
That's great. And that started, you've already completed it, obviously, in your report. What was the sort of the time frame in which that pilot took place, and how extensive was it in terms of samples?
Right. So, conversations with our transportation department began in, mid to late 2019, and looking at, once we decided, kind of the scope of the project to how we were going to design it, we really then were able to implement it. We had a variety of sites that were poured. And so those pours ranged from March to May of 2020.
Gotcha.
And can you give us a basic rundown about how the pilot was designed and implemented?
Sure. So I think I mentioned earlier that what we were trying to do with the pilot was really address some of the questions that our project managers and engineers had around using alternatives to 100% cement mixes. So some of the key questions that they had were, what are the strength differences, both early strength gain and over time? How does it perform? How would they perform to our 100% cement mixes? Wanting to also know about just workability, what do the concrete finishers think? Are they hate to try to finish it? Is it harder to finish? Is it harder to flow? Does it require more manual labor to work with one versus another? There were questions also just about availability, pricing. Would it affect project schedules if there's a change in how quickly the concrete sets? Do they have to wait longer to pull away forms? Things like that. They wanted to know what the impacts were on all those levels. And they're all very valid questions. And the only way to really get some of those answers was to do these pilots in a very structured way. So what we decided to do is we also wanted to reduce variables in terms of weather and site locations. And we wanted to also reduce any potential biases. So we also included 2 different concrete producers as well as 2 different concrete finishers to contractors to get different opinions and different sources for materials, to also look at more than one sources of data, so to speak, for the pilot test. So what we did is we identified intersections that were getting scheduled to have the sidewalk ramps redone for ADA compatibility. And we looked at those intersections where you would have at least 4, it's a 4-way intersection with 4 curves on it, and where we could put the 100% cement mix on 2 corners and the alternative on the other 2 corners, so that they were being compared at the same site and being poured on the same day. And so we repeated that design approach at 6 different locations. So we ended up testing overall 12 ramp locations. And then also we did 5 different alternative mixes and 2 different 100% cement mixes overall. We also factored in terms of gathering data, we did have our contractors, like the site managers, interview their workers about workability and flow and finishing of the mix. We attempted to do that so that without the finishers knowing ahead of time which mix was which. I think they probably already guessed though, just because they're used to working with different mixes, But that said, that was part of the design as well, as getting that more descriptive feedback from the finishers as well about if any of the mixes were red flags.
Yeah, and the pilots, like like you mentioned, there's a few different mixes that you did, and variations of proportions, with slag and carbon cure and slag. So how were these mixes determined? I know you mentioned a little bit about the mixes, but can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Right. So once we identified the project sites for the pilot projects, we had kind of like a project meeting with the contractors and the concrete producers. And it was just a discussion, frankly, with all of them about which mixes we wanted to try. And the concrete producers in both cases already had slag mixes available in their portfolio. And so we decided to work with the slag mixes, and we wanted to see also any differences in how far we could push the envelope, so to speak, in terms of percent slag. So the other factor was, okay, at least 30% slag, and then we ratcheted it up a bit to test a few higher percentages as well. And I should add that one of our producers already also had the carbon cure technology installed at one of their plants. And so we decided to look at having carbon cure added to one of the 30% mixes. And that was not so much about trying to reduce the carbon footprint, but more about trying to see if the carbon cure would increase early strength gain.
What were the main takeaways, I guess, from that experience? Because it's really interesting that you incorporated, obviously not just doing a technical review of the material over time, but also doing the more qualitative, sort of interaction with the provider and with the GCs. What were high level, top line, sort of the big takeaways of the pilot? They're very well laid out in your report, but if you could summarize for me.
Right, sure. I would say the biggest takeaway is that it was a successful pilot. We demonstrated that the lower carbon mixes performed just as well. They met all our performance requirements. There wasn't any impact on schedule or cost or availability. There weren't any red flags essentially really raised. The only thing that I think is a key lesson learned is that there is a difference between the low carbon mixes and the 100% cement mixes on early strength gain. So in this case, it wasn't a big enough difference to impact the sidewalk application. I think it's something that we will have to pay attention more to on other types of applications where maybe there's a more significant concern about early strength gain. So key lesson learned there. But overall, it demonstrates that there's a very easily and, essentially technological solution already available to us to reduce the footprint of our concrete use in terms of sidewalk applications.
So, part of the measurement here of success, obviously, what was the climate impact below sort of baseline typical business as usual concrete? Were you able to measure that, these low carbon mixes here? What kind of impact was actually made from a climate or carbon perspective?
Right. Since we already had the EPEAT data for all the mixes, we were able to calculate kind of a baseline versus pilot project comparison of the global warming potential in change, the delta there. And what the project resulted in was that it demonstrated that we could reduce the carbon footprint of an average curb replacement project by 23 to 34%.
Yeah. Can you describe more about what type of tests were required to test the strength and durability?
Right. So we do require a specific portfolio of tests according to the ASTM standards. And part of that is the compressive strength testing at days. So 7 days, 14 days, 28 days. We added 56 days for this particular pilot project because we wanted to see farther out how it performs. It also go on site to test things as the mix is being poured, things like entrained air, temperature, slump, things like that. That's all standard, and that's what we did for this project as well. we also are, for this project, adding on visual inspections after the pours. So we're having our materials lab staff go out to the project sites at the 3, 6, 9, and 12 month marks after pour to just do visual inspections to see how those different mixes are holding up over time. So yeah, and we did. We have our own materials testing lab that can do the compressive strength test. So they collected the cores during the project and conducted that testing for us. And so we had that data that then was able to demonstrate for us the differences, primarily in early strength gain. There was, if you read the case study, you'll see that there's a chart showing that at the end of the day, they all basically reached the same level of strength or had the same range of strength between the 100% cement mixes and the slag mixes.
Gotcha. That's great. So one of the things that you kind of touched on already in some of your responses, but what we're really interested in facing right now is that this is obviously an educational process. It's really about raising awareness and comfort levels across many different stakeholders, both within the city and among contractors and concrete companies. And you've hinted at it already a little bit, but can you kind of talk a little bit about what that was like in terms of what some of the sticking points were or big questions? And at the end it sounds like one measure of success for this pilot is that people were generally sort of satisfied with working with these alternate materials. But can you give us a little bit of a narrative of what that was like engaging all those stakeholders?
Right. So I'll just start off saying that when I first decided to pursue a lower carbon concrete initiative and start requiring the EPDs, for the city, each of our infrastructure departments has a chief engineer, and they're kind of, the one you really want to get the buy-in in first. And that's what I did. I went around to all the chief engineers and talked them through the idea about requiring EPDs and then eventually doing some pilots. And, they were all on board. Some of their key concerns was, well, how available are EPDs? How much will that cause a delay in anything, requiring an EPD for a project. And, fortunately, there had already been some groundwork laid there for us by our Oregon Department of Environmental Quality in working with local concrete producers and developing EPDs. So I was lucky in that perspective that it was easy for me to go to those stakeholders, our chief engineers, and say, look, requiring the EPDs is doable. There's already local producers here that we work with that have them. So, kind of after getting their buy-in, and it's then moves on to, okay, they gave me some ideas of who to reach out to in terms of project managers and engineers on their teams to further discuss the idea and also potential pilots. And that's where we came up with all those questions about their concerns about, well, how is this going to perform and things along those lines? And what kind of questions should we address the pilot? What do we need to know? And from there, it was working with the contractors and the concrete producers. And fortunately, again, because the concrete producers in our area and the ones we partnered with on these pilot projects had already worked with EPDs, had already known some about this topic and embodied carbon, and had already had some material, some slag mixes in their portfolio. It was actually a fairly easy conversation to have with them about doing these pilots. They were highly engaged and willing. And then from there, it was then working with the contractors themselves and having that initial meeting about why are we doing this and what's their role and what are we looking for from them in terms of information and feedback, and really engaging them and helping them see that they're part of this. I would say some of their key concerns was, well, I'm trying a mix I haven't used before. If it doesn't go right, are you going to come after me and, make me pay for redoing it or something like that? So that was just something that, we addressed. We weren't going to put them on the hook for anything that could be attributed to the mix itself. And, but unfortunately, as I mentioned, that didn't occur. Everything performed really well.
That's great. And just to look at, obviously we're interested, as you described, in sidewalks leading to something else,
Mm-hmm.
And so I know this is just still very recent history for you, but I'm curious, What are the sort of the knock-on effects of this that are either happening right now or that you think both in regard to sidewalks within Portland and other uses of concrete? What are you sort of seeing as the impact?
Well, I think one of the immediate impacts is just being able to talk about the successes of the story and talk about how it was a very collaborative effort amongst all the different stakeholders. And that's building enough interest and trust in this that there's more interest in doing additional pilots for different applications. So I think that's one key benefit and result of what has happened so far. The other part of the low carbon concrete initiative that I'm working on is working with external stakeholders, engineering firms, concrete producers, architects, and some of our construction contractors about really thinking bigger term about, okay, could we potentially set global warming potential thresholds for certain strength classes of concrete, similar to what Marin County did in California. And there's going to be a lot of data that's being collected for that to inform the conversation. And the pilot results is just something a little more tangible to lend to that conversation as well.
Yeah, and just looking back on it, do you feel like just the learning curve advancements that came with the sidewalk project really did help build a bridge sort of to those, sort of more ambitious, like it's sort of an essential step that had to take place beforehand?
Well, I think it does two things. It strengthens relationships. It's about relationship building amongst all these stakeholders, and I place a lot of value on that because nothing is going to. There's not going to be lasting change unless all the stakeholders feel like they're a part of this and take ownership over it. And then the second thing is again demonstrating feasibility, right? We've demonstrated, although it's only been one application, that it works, and it's on an application, fortunately, that we do a lot of work on. We do a lot of flat work. Even if it's not always sidewalk, it might be a different application of flat work. We do a lot of flat work. We work with a lot of applications in that strength class. And so I think lends to a lot of buy-in in saying, well, let's try it on a different application.
And what are other types of carbon reducing inputs and methods beyond that, what you mentioned in the pilot, that we should consider moving forward?
Well, I think, and I didn't mention this earlier, but one of the other things that really became apparent in the pilot was that a lot of the mixes were over-designed. And what I mean by that is that our specification for that application was 3,000 PSI by day 28. And, all the mixes met that by day 14. And at the end, some of the mixes were as high as, 5,500 to 6,000 PSI. So, one of the strategies we could potentially pursue in terms of reducing our carbon footprint of these mixes is actually just reducing the volume of cement for some of these mixes. For those things that don't need early strength gain by right off the bat, for things that we don't really need a 6,000 PSI sidewalk, there is opportunity there just to do that. So I think that's one strategy that we'll be discussing further. The other part is really, we have some suppliers trying to come into the area for glass pozzolan. So, I think there's going to be other opportunities for us to test, hopefully, other supplemental cementitious materials besides slag, and I'd be very interested in pursuing those once we have more opportunity to do so. And I think overall, just having a better conversation about how we specify concrete, and I think this will happen a lot when we're discussing potential global warming potential thresholds in the near future, is really thinking about, do we have a very static specification for concrete like we do now, or do we have more kind of conversation with the producers, with the contractors about how to really maximize reducing the carbon footprint while also meeting our performance specifications, and really take an approach that way as opposed to trying to do more of a one-size-fits-all approach.
What kind of interest have you seen from other local governments following the pilot after what happened?
Right.
Know what?
Well, no, I mean, certainly I've received calls from not only just locally, some of my colleagues locally in other cities or counties in the area about this pilot project, but also nationally. I mean, people are as kind of, there's this kind of ongoing movement about looking at especially the embodied carbon of building materials right now, and I think all that's driven by some of the green building industry, but people are interested in and paying attention. There aren't that many case studies about low embodied carbon concrete and how it performs in a real life application. I mean, not to say that it hasn't been, people aren't doing this and are working about it, but not a lot of them have really written anything up about it, it seems. So I have been getting a lot of calls and questions, and there's interest, but I can't say to what extent that's leading change in those areas.
Yeah, it's interesting how the Northwest, I mean, just from Vancouver all the way down to San Francisco has really become sort of an epicenter of this kind of work. Washington State, obviously, it's really interesting how that's taking shape. So we have a lot to learn on the East Coast and pretty much everywhere else.
And what recommendations would you give to other jurisdictions, like let's say in New York, for this similar pilot, like what we're thinking of? What type of recommendations can you suggest?
Yeah, I think having those conversations with all the key stakeholders, especially the concrete producers. I mean, they know how to design concrete, and they know where in terms of like you can go to them and you can say, well, this project I need an early strength fan. I needed to do this by this day. But over here on this concrete slab that, is not going to receive any loads on it for a particular period of time, I don't need that early strength gain. I can, have a different mix over there with a even lower, carbon footprint on it, or a higher slag percentage, or whatever the SCN is that's being used. So I think just having those conversations with the concrete producers, and then, especially in bringing the contractors as well, is invaluable. I mean, it can really lead to some innovations and perhaps some eye-opening that, oh my gosh, we already know how to do this. Why aren't we doing it?
Yeah. Well, Stacey, this is,
Exactly.
you've given us everything we wanted and more. So this is excellent. And I want to thank you for the last 20 something minutes, but also really want to thank you for the work that you described today. I mean, it's hard to kind of understate how back here on the East Coast, how critical it is to be looking at jurisdictions that have really moved forward on this. And repeatedly, we've really been going back to Portland and really looking at what you're doing. And it's been a real major influence. So I want to thank you for your insights, but more, I want to thank you for your work.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate it.